You're listening to Toronto's #1 real estate podcast, powered by Watson Estates. The most successful local real estate investing starts right here, right now. Here's your host, broker, investor, and social media influencer, Bradley Watson.
Good morning, investors. Bradley here from Watson Estates, and it is bright and early, and I'm excited to hit you guys up this Friday, talk about what we've kind of seen in the real estate market through this week, and talk about what's to come next. I'm so happy you can continue to join us here on Google Podcast, #1 real estate podcast for the city of Toronto. And today we're going to talk about whether things are actually selling with highlights on pre-construction and resale units. And then we want to dive into talking about whether residential tenants are planning on paying as of May 1st. And we want to talk about whether businesses and the new rent relief program that came out within the last week are going to be effective in protecting businesses from collapsing under the pressure of this economic toll that's coming from the pandemic. And of course, today is May 1st, and that means it's going to be May meme is going around. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a Justin Timberlake, it's going to be May. I got it from my sister-in-law, and I have to roll my eyes. I see it every single year. And then May the 4th is coming soon too. So this is the best time of year for all of our Star Wars fans as well. So shout out to you guys. Okay, let's move right along. I want to jump into talking about specifically the pre-construction, which is kind of an angle we haven't discussed in the last little bit here on our podcast. If you've been tuning on, we've been kind of talking more about general statistics. And so this article actually highlights a pre-construction project. And so I like it, and I want to share it with you because the question is okay, fine. They're buyers. They seem to be a little bit more attracted to moving in this marketplace. Although sales are down, they seem to be kind of picking up. And if you don't know that, please go back in our last few podcasts and listen, because there's a ton of info that has just been splashing in our face, and I want to make sure you guys are fully informed. But this article comes from Toronto Stories, and it's called $5 million in 5 days. Buyers appear unafraid of the COVID market. This is the article. Sometimes the market speaks in places you don't always expect. 20 minutes outside of downtown Hamilton, nestled in the quaint little town of Caledonia, an Empire Communities development called Avalon is offering some insights into the real estate industry in the time of COVID-19. Last week seems to be when everything is has changed now, or news is becoming a little bit more optimistic. Empire launched phase 5 of what they hope will eventually be 3,000 new family homes across 530 acres. The semi-detached, small detached, and large detached home they release range from the high 400s, semis, to the mid 600s, which are the detached. In 5 days, they had sold half of their phase 5 inventory. They did so without a single buyer coming to a sales office or seeing a model home. That's interesting, by the way. One of the challenges that has led to a lot of the development of rental spaces across the city of Toronto has been the time frame of which it takes to sell a pre-construction, right? You need to collect a certain portion of pre-construction sales before you can begin the development, because you're trying to get all this money to come in. And so with that sales period, you got to pay for salespeople, and you got to pay for marketing, you got to have an office, and all of this stuff comes as an additional cost that isn't in place for rental units. And so actually the irony here is, because everybody's online, it's okay that way. And I'm assuming, and as we're hearing here, these individuals are saving money in their sales office. But you can make the counter argument, well, of course, sales are down, which is true. But at the same time, it's a fun fact to see that sales offices are functioning right now virtually. And they said everything was done virtually. What's more, according to Don Fleming, president of TFN Realty, the houses being purchased in Phase 5 were all roughly $20,000 higher than those sold in Phase 4, which just closed in February. So for those of you out there that are giving my clients awesome deals and dropping your prices like flies, I hope you guys are listening here, recognize that home prices in the new construction have actually gone up from February. Yes, March sucked. But here's the thing, guys. We're coming back, and we're going to be coming back strong. All of this is to say the comparison in sales between pre- and post-COVID outbreak in Empire's low-rise communities hasn't been drastically affected. Here's another thing to think about that I want to mention. This is not downtown Toronto. This is outside of Hamilton. Busy city, but is on the outskirts, so the affordability is still there. So when you guys are hearing, 400s, 600s, yes, it's more affordable. I get it, right? But it's interesting to see just what a pre-construction is going through right now. And then they do go on to say that it does seem like it's affected because they would have typically been sold out 80% of phase 5 in the same time frame, right? So they would have, now they sold half, but they would have been 80. But then this is what I find very fascinating. They note that every single one of the buyers was an end user. Our buyers were all real people, real families from places like Maple, Georgetown, and Mississauga. Probably the difference between now and pre-COVID-19 is that the more difficult units would also have likely sold by now to investors banking on capital appreciation. But in this market, it's the investors that are holding off. Well, that's interesting. So my question is why are the investors holding off? Maybe they're anticipating that it's a bad investment, right? So I would be cautious. I'm generally cautious about pre-construction anyways. For anyone that doesn't know, I tend to lean to resale. Pre-construction, by the way, they pay realtors 4% generally for commissions. So you make more money selling pre-construction. And I'm happy to lead my clients there if that's what they want to do. But at the same time, they do price gouge. And so, okay, prices did come down 8 to 10%, but you guys are selling it at a $20,000 markup. You can see it kind of painted in that picture as well. But that's to say pre-constructions are still selling. It just seems like the investors are holding off. Maybe they're saying, you know what, I'm going to either wait for a better deal or maybe they are getting better deals elsewhere. Did anybody think about that? Moving right on. You guys know just yesterday, I believe it was, we were talking about cottages. You can go back in our podcast and listen to that as well. If you're interested in how that's all working, they do the same reference here just as kind of reinforcement to the strength of our market. So they talk about that exact same article, how in March we're seeing an uptick in inquiries and physical showings. They also go in to talk about another video we did. Actually, this was yesterday as well. Funny thing is, these all come from Toronto Stories, and so they're cross-promoting their articles also. Good job, guys. And that talks about how there was a 7.8% increase, nearly an 8% increase in forecasted home prices from TD. And I did happen to mention 8.7 by accident, so correction to all of that. I mentioned it on YouTube as well. That was a 7.8% increase, but it's all the same. They're talking about a far greater increase than anybody's kind of been expecting. And so whether it's a 12-minute drive from Hamilton, across the street from TIFF, or a Muskoka chair somewhere hours away from the city, buyers are continuing to show they're not afraid of COVID. So fascinating. And as promised, you're going to continue to see positive news coming out. That's just what I'm expecting. I'm just expecting more and more positive news right now. You're going to hear negative news, and I'm going to bring you the negative news. So buckle your seatbelt. Don't feel like you're getting off the hook because all of a sudden things seem to be a little bit more optimistic. We're going to hit you with the hard stuff. But I do think you're going to see more positivity coming out of our marketplace in the coming weeks. Investors, tune your ears. Don't miss this opportunity, guys. I don't know how much longer you got. I think you'll have a bit of time. But as far as getting those killer deals, like the super ones, the fear in the market is going to dwindle. And so here's the thing. Any step to reopening our economy seems to be one step closer. And so as we kind of move along, one thing I wanted to mention just in passing here was that the Ontario government has released, this was part of our news yesterday, guidelines for businesses to reopen safely. And I don't want to get into all the details, but it does seem as though cases are going down. Now, they were up from the day before. They were higher by 2.3%, which matters because what the province is watching for is they want to have consistent 2 to 4 week declines in the growth of COVID cases. And so we kind of are still at that day one. We're waiting for that beginning for, you know what would suck? Just as it comes on, imagine if we had like 1.5 weeks of decline and all of a sudden you get one day where it kind of blips up a little bit and it kind of throws up. Anyways, that would suck. Anyways, so we're trying to watch consistent growth. This is what the health officials in Canada are doing. And so once that kind of rolls out, but what I love is seeing the charts, and I love seeing that curve is on the other side and it's now coming down. It's so cool. Let's keep it going, guys. Keep that physical distancing. So some of the things they kind of talk about, they pretty much are talking to office workers, retail and food services, construction, transportation, agriculture, and film and TV. And they say things like we want to maintain physical distances and workspaces, and we don't want people sharing telephones. They're talking about how if you can do online delivery, do that, curbside pickup options. For in-store settings, businesses should rely more on cashless transactions, installing barriers, and all of these things, right? Like sanitizing carts and baskets and sanitizing customers upon entry. And that they recommend if you can't do these things, at the last resort, have personal protective equipment, PPE. So fancy. Get that PPE. And transits were encouraged to reduce the number of people on board, whether it's limiting passengers and stuff. All of these things affecting the revenues of the city, which we've talked about in the past as well. They're either spending more and more transit in place, or they're collecting less in revenues. These things it's kind of a double whammy. And all of these things, one of the things they say is that they're not mandatory, but they expect businesses will follow the guidelines. And they say, well, if your customers see that you're not following our rules, then just you wait on the other end, you're not going to be a successful business, right? So there's no mandatory requirement for these things. They're just kind of leaving it up to everybody else. Okay, and one more article just to kind of drill home whether we are in optimistic environment or negative environment. An article came out of my friends at betterdwelling.com. One thing to notice about Better Dwelling, they are very real as far as info goes, and they will hold nothing back. If they see any kind of negative news, they will make sure to include it in their articles. And anybody that's kind of doom and gloomers, whenever I see them reading Better Dwellings, I'm like, of course they're reading a damn Better Dwelling article. Duh. Okay, so this is their article. Canada's GDP growth is flat, but real estate outperforms. The Canadian economy has been leaning more and more on real estate these days. Statistics Canada data shows gross domestic product GDP was flat in February. Despite the flat growth, real estate advanced and significantly outperformed the general economy. The article in the body says the real estate sector is still one of the fastest growing parts of the economy. The real estate rental and leasing portion of GDP grew 0.5% in February from a month before. That is an increase of 5.9% from the same month last year. This was the sixth largest growth for any segment in the month for both the monthly and annual increase. The Canadian economy was slowing before the pandemic, and most projections showed that as it slowed, real estate continued to do the heavy lifting, helping to prevent a negative print in February. The percent of the economy attributed to real estate rental and leasing is now the highest since 2016. So what this article is kind of explaining, it's a little bit wordy actually. I had to cut right through the fat on this one, but they're talking about how the real estate segment seems to be what's propping up the marketplace, right? They're outperforming, but they're also kind of maintaining the rates. And their accusation was the GDP wasn't very good in February. Even before everything came down, it wasn't very good. Remember, Better Dwelling is the most optimistic news article out there. So they're talking about how, let's be real here. We didn't have the greatest economy going into everything collapsing here. And then they're saying, but real estate seemed to be what propped everything up. So then my question to you is real estate maybe what's going to prop everything up on the other end? Some food for thought. Okay, now I want to talk about, as we kind of get through the market, just as another kind of angle to what the real estate market has been doing, I want to talk about, today is May 1st. Rent payments are due. Landlords are sweating bricks across our great province. And so the question is whether people are going to pay or not. So here's an article called Anxiety Rises for Tenants and Landlords as May Rent Comes Due. Uncertainty is growing around how many Canadian tenants will decide not to pay all or part of their monthly rent on May 1st because their finances have been hit by job losses and business closures as a result of the pandemic. Quote, we are seeing landlords and tenants pitting against each other today, and that is just going to get worse and worse every month that this progresses. That comes from the CEO of Landlord BC. I guess that's some kind of, they're calling it rental housing. They represent 3,300 rental housing landlords across the province. The organization surveyed 457 of its members in April and found that 10% of them didn't collect any rent, while nearly one quarter collected only partial rent. So we were thinking anywhere from 20 to 30%. So we were bang on that one. Those findings aren't far off an analysis done by CIBC that estimates that 75% of tenants in Canada paid April rent in full, while 10% paid part of it. So it's kind of a little different, but still 25% seems to be where people are. Like 75 are doing it, 25 are up in the air. Most provinces and territories have put temporary moratoriums on evictions, which includes Ontario. And they're saying the federal government should include a rent subsidy program considering the 1/3 of Canada households rent. And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about as well, just as a side thought, I had someone comment on one of our YouTube videos, and thank you for catching it. I actually did mention a few podcasts back. Sorry, it was a podcast. I'm so used to saying videos because we've been doing videos for years, and this podcast thing is still kind of new, so we're figuring it out. But I had mentioned in one of our podcasts that the rent increases were frozen, which is not actually the case in Ontario. So I kind of retract that statement. Ontario does not have a rent hike freeze, but there are provinces who do. So where that error happened was in a mix-up in, I guess, some news that I'd read in the provinces. So here in Ontario, we don't have that rent freeze, but moving right along, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau addressed the request for rent relief, saying rent relief should rest with the provinces. It's not my fault. It's his fault. It's up to them, not my problem. And so this is why we've been talking about rent relief for weeks, actually, long before the updates and even before, I think our rent relief came out even before the stats for last month. Like, it's about to be a month ago now, where we were saying, guys, let's get some rent relief out here. And people need it, right? It'll remove the tension between landlords and tenants. And so now it looks like there's more and more yelling happening. But here's the thing. Today's May 1st. So even if you applied this, you're still people in a pickle. Now, realistically, evictions haven't happened, so maybe they can backdate it. And one of the things that they talk about is in answering how much it should be, they reference BC, who does have this, and they're giving $300 subsidies of their gross income. It was less than $74,150 in 2019. So based on income, if they have dependents, they get up to $500 subsidy, and this money goes directly to the landlords. And they're even saying that that's not enough, which I would agree. That's like, really, what is $300 or $500? The concept is good, but it should be higher. We're not going to be able to prop up a Vancouver home with $500 subsidy if you got kids. And so then on the flip side, we got landlords concerned. Most of the listeners to our podcast are investors and landlords. And guys, we're hearing those concerns. At least I'm hearing those concerns. And I'm hoping that there is some kind of rent relief that comes to bail you guys out. The Alberta Residential Landlords Association estimates that its members had 80% of the tenants pay rent in April, with 13% negotiating payment arrangements so rent could be paid in installments. The Ontario Landlord Association, which represents small landlords who don't own entire complexes but rather individual units and suites, also conducted an internal survey of its members. The senior member of the Ontario Association, who also rents out units in BC and Alberta, said their numbers show that 20% of their tenants paid rent in full. The rest either partially paid, arranged payment plans, used deposits on the property to cover April rent, or didn't pay at all. That is a massive number. Okay, 20% of their tenants paid. So for those small-time investors, that you guys are getting spanked out there in comparison to the bigger landlords and the bigger companies. And I guess this is an argument for people in why you'd want a property management company. Those are some of the arguments they'd say, is they in a situation like this, they can better navigate that environment and not leave you hanging, which the tenants are going to do if it's just some little guy that's got a couple properties. What are you going to do, man? And of course, our friends at Keep Your Rent are still nice and loud. They're posting signs in elevators and making sure that tenants are fully educated on their rights, which is a good thing. But I just think that the rights may have gone too far in that there's no protection for landlords, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect the tenants, but I do think that we should be protecting the landlords, which is where I think a rent relief is, in my mind, that is the best option in doing that. Here's the thing too. There's a huge echo when someone doesn't pay rent. Many landlords rely on the income to cover their mortgages. It also talks about how many are choosing bills are getting paid, right? So people are having to decide whether they're evaluating their finances. This is the challenge of the renter, right? So all of this becomes a predicament and a controversy between landlords and tenants. And let's just fix this with rent relief, or let's start opening this economy. And these things are all around good, but you are definitely seeing an increase in the number of rentals coming on the market in general. We won't cover that today. Go back if you want to hear that, and we'll continue to cover that as time goes on. So that's the residential side, right? You got tenants and landlords and the residents, and I think we kind of see that, especially for those of you who are investors out there. But I also want to talk about the commercial landlord side, because there has been some pretty big news that came out in the last week or two. I think the podcast was labeled something like, did Trudeau single-handedly save small businesses? Something like that was our podcast a little while back that we did. And it was this announcement of this giant program that's going to come by and it's going to just sweep the nation and save everything. And it seems as though landlords and tenants both agree that it is the single best policy that was made in helping get things back on track. But the question is whether it's working. So here's the first article. Commercial landlords brace for May to be worse yet as tenants grapple with rent. For the past 7 years, this is talking about one individual, and they're saying that they have been able to pay rent over the last 7 years for their artisanal bakery, a coffee shop Bread by Us uses in Ottawa. So this year is different. Come Friday, there'll be no check in the mail, no wad of cash, and no e-transfer to her landlord. We pay close to $6,000 a month in rent, and we're able to meet that in April. and we're absolutely not able to meet that in May. When we paid that in April, it was after not operating for 2 weeks, so it was a really big hit to our cash flow. Some other big payments came through at that time, and they put us in a position where we would be completely impossible, or at best, really not a good business decision to make that little we have left to pay rent. So it becomes a better business decision to not pay rent when not paying rent in the commercial sphere means closure. How desperate. I think it's going to be worse than April 1st. So and that comes from the Executive Vice President, National Lead of Retail for JLL Canada. The news, guys, on the commercial side is very negative. I'm dealing with an agent right now on the residential side. He has commercial clients, and he's saying that it is crazy busy. You've got people that are claiming insolvency. They're going into receivership, and we've got on the other side, we've got people that are just snaking these deals, getting crazy deals on people dumping these properties. So it is nuts over there. And the reason is because they don't have the same level of protection for tenants and the removal of evictions and all these things. There's a lot less restriction on the commercial side. And am I, as a landlord, by deferring or abating rent, throwing good money after bad? Here's the other thing. Sanderson believes that landlords are asking themselves if the tenant seeking a break on rent is a business that wasn't going to survive regardless of COVID-19. So what I think is the conflict here is you're still a business, right? So you're deciding, well, am I going to collect rent? Was I going to collect rent? Is this business even going to succeed? Or were they failing in the first place, right? We hear GDP was going down. Remember that article? So maybe they were already struggling. And so do you want to defer rent, or do you work with them on rent when now's your opportunity to kick them out and maybe find somebody better on the other side? This was interesting. Cadillac Fairview, which owns some of the country's highest profile malls, including the Eaton Centre in Toronto and Pacific Centre in Vancouver, confirmed to the Canadian press that between 20 and 25% of its tenants have paid rent for this month, and the company has deferred April and May rents for a, quote, significant amount of its retail clients. Retail is getting absolutely spanked. 20 to 25% paying their rent at that level. You're in the Eaton Centre and you're paying only 25% collecting rent. Wow. They predict that top tier malls will see some impact around commercial rent, but will ultimately survive. Malls in second tier markets will be more affected, he thinks. So if you're operating kind of a small local retail sector, like small businesses are in your area, you're a second, I guess they define it as a second tier landlord, second tier businesses or market, you're going to find yourself in a really tough spot. And this is the opportunity for the little guy to get squished and the big guy to eventually come in and buy them all up, of course. A recent survey from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business revealed that more than half of small businesses are not able to pay rent without support. This number is high 75% for the hospitality sector. About 50, which makes sense because like who's renting a hotel right now? About 54% of those surveyed trust their landlord to be reasonable, and 75% believe the cost of commercial rent cannot be paid due to COVID-19 revenue losses should be shared between governments, landlords, and tenants. Basically, it's going to be another 2 weeks of me kind of white knuckling and hoping for the best. But here's what I want to kind of summarize this. This is the cornerstone of this entire point with landlords and tenants in this feud. Here it is, guys. The new Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program that we rolled out just recently, again, I think it was within the last week we were talking about this thing. This was massive news. This is huge news. The question is it going to work? And I am hearing, talk about the negative news, I am hearing very pessimistic things from this article anyways. This is from retailinsider.com. It says, in fact, the article is actually only one in 5 landlords in Canada stepping up to offer retail small businesses rent relief ahead of May 1st due date. Why does this matter? Before I get in this article, this matters because this, although it's such a massive program, the government's going to cover 50%, tenant covered 25%, and landlord covered 25%, is optional by the landlord. So if the landlord chooses to not apply this, and this hasn't rolled out yet, by the way, this is coming in the next few days. So they're actually kind of doing, it's a bit of a unknown for these landlords on whether they should kind of throw the hammer and, collect rent and just be overcritical or wait. So the timing is also really bad for landlords. So it says, in fact, a survey by Save Small Business, a grassroots coalition of close to 40,000 small businesses across Canada, found that only 1 in 5 small businesses expect their landlord to sign on to the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program announced recently by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Maybe Justin Trudeau didn't save the commercial industry because he made it optional. And that's what this article goes on to say. Quote, we were worried about it, so that's why we asked a question in the survey. said Shell of the query to small business owners about their landlord's appetite to support the federal program. I wouldn't say that we're surprised, but we're sort of heartbroken. I don't know if that's the right term. It's a real problem, obviously. We're hearing it all over the place. People are talking to their landlords about it, and they're either getting a, well, let's wait and see approach, which is what we just talked about, the timing, or it seems like too much work for me, or I'm just not going to do it. Which, I mean, okay. I think that's a bit of a weaker argument, but maybe, right? Like maybe they don't want to do paperwork or whatever, but it's 50% of your rent plus 25. They're actually getting 75% of their rent. So I think that's a weaker argument, but fine. The Save Small Business Survey, which was conducted on Monday, found that 67% of small businesses said the rent assistance program is the most important support rolled out by governments to date, with the Canada Emergency Benefit Account loan picking up 24% and the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy by 9%. Of course, that's not as popular because that's more so for bigger businesses, the wage subsidy. But because they're dealing with so many people, that is. But here's the thing. So obviously for small businesses, this small business assistance program that we've now seen was the big deal, right? To these guys anyways. Nearly 54% said that without a CECRA rent reduction, their business will not survive, with another 43% saying the program will make their survival more likely. Only 3% of small businesses said the rent abatement had no impact on their ability to survive. So everybody is saying that this applies. And so some of the recommendations they said is the simplest thing is make it mandatory. So I wanted to kind of talk about that. Should this be something that is mandatory? If you really want this program to fly, then yes, I would say it should be mandatory. But the thing is can you make the landlord paying 25% mandatory? It's giving the same. See, here's the thing. There's a lot more flexibility on the commercial side, right? Like if a tenant doesn't pay after 15 days, on the 16th day, you can kick them out, right? There's a lot more protection for the landlord. This is not dealing with the same as residential where the tenant lives there and it's more important. This is businesses, right? So to make a decision as a mandatory requirement for businesses is a big deal, right? That's pretty invasive. The other thing that happens here is they need to open up their books. A lot of businesses need to open their books in order to apply for this program because there's limits on it, right? Like not everyone qualifies for this. There is limits in place and I don't have them in front of me, but there's a certain amount of money and revenue that they need to have lost, or a certain amount of revenue of max that they need to be able to be within. So they need to be able to show their books, and some people don't want to do that. So there's a lot of privacy and there's a lot of risks and issues with making this a mandatory thing. So will that be the case? Maybe not. But because it might not be the case, this might mean that maybe this program didn't work, right? Maybe this isn't going to fly. And so because today is May 1st, we're going to see those stats coming out over the next little bit. And in 16 days from now, we're going to see real in front of us, real numbers on whether businesses are still operating in their place. But ultimately, kicking them out is ultimately up to the landlord. And this is a business decision. No hard feelings. I'm going to leave it there for today. Enjoy your weekend. I'm going to be back because, real estate has no weekends. And I'll see you guys tomorrow morning with another podcast here on Toronto's #1 real estate podcast. And of course, Sunday's our day off. And so we're going to rest on our Sabbath. And we will see you again on Monday. So I hope you guys got an awesome week. We are seeing numbers going through the roof on our podcast. Thank you so much for all the love and support and all the comments, because we're able to build things based on what people are saying and what the news is. And I'm creating my own thinking on this too. I don't have all the answers. I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. But as we continue to educate ourselves and learn the news, and hopefully you guys are getting a little bit of value of me explaining what my thinking is on all of these topics, we're able to grow and develop our businesses as small-time investors in the residential industry here in Toronto. What an amazing city we live in. What a beautiful day it's supposed to be. And this weekend's supposed to be lovely too. Enjoy the nice time outside. Don't get too close to each other. And I'll see you next time. Take care and keep it real.